Welcome back! If you're just joining the series, you may consider watching the setup video so you're ready to keep coding and learning. In this video, we will learn about the fundamentals of accessibility to ensure your website is usable by everyone. Check the video description for a link to an article with the video transcript, as well as the link to a live example of today's demonstration. In this lesson, we will not create new code. Instead, I will demonstrate what accessibility is and the basic considerations for ensuring you create accessible web experiences. First, let's start with a definition of accessibility from the Web Accessibility Initiative, or WAI. Web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. More specifically, people can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, and contribute to the web. The WAI goes on to point out that it isn't just folks with clearly recognized disabilities, but also temporary or less perceivable impairments, such as people using devices with small screens, or changing abilities due to aging, or temporary disablement such as a broken arm, or situational limitations, such as screen glare from bright lights or the sun. It is possible to account for these scenarios, but it takes a conscious effort. Fortunately, there are in-depth guidelines and a wealth of resources to learn how to do it and to test outcomes. Fundamentally, accessibility on the web starts with using HTML semantically. So congrats! You've already learned the bare essentials to making accessible web experiences from our first few lessons. Today, we'll look at a few additional points to keep in mind as you move forward on your coding journey. Learning how to make accessible web experiences an inherent part of how you develop is not only the right thing to do, it will give you a leg up in the job market. And surprisingly, this is an area that a lot of online experiences unfortunately tend to neglect. The topics we'll cover include hierarchy, content, contrast, and keyboard interaction. Note that this lesson is not exhaustive of all accessibility concerns, but is intended to place basic concepts in your development toolbox. We've actually already covered hierarchy throughout the HTML lessons. To recap, hierarchy begins with defining the structure of your text content with appropriate headings. Let me demonstrate how this can help a vision-impaired user who needs to use assistive technology, often in the form of a screen reader. Being on a Mac, I have a built-in screen reader called VoiceOver, or VO for short. I'm going to open that, and you'll see this window has appeared that provides written text in addition to the spoken feedback. Within my example web page, I'm going to trigger a keyboard command to display the headings. Then, using my arrow keys, I can scroll through the list, and then use the return key to select one. See how there has also been a black box added to the heading 3 as an additional visual indication of where VoiceOver is focused on the page. Using an additional keyboard command, I can request VoiceOver to read the document to me. Again, VO places a black box as a visual indicator as it moves throughout the document. VO was able to read that content very easily because it is using defined type elements. But there are other ways to define textual content, and a requirement for accessibility is that all content is perceivable. This means any non-text content should provide a text alternative, and there are several ways this can be done. A common scenario that we've also already discussed is providing descriptions of images by way of the alt attribute. So let's move to the next section in this document and see how VO is able to read the images thanks to the alt text. The next key component is contrast. Contrast generally refers to color contrast of text or interface components, but for text, it can also mean legibility. The first section shows examples of poor text contrast. The first two primarily demonstrate poor color contrast. Text must meet a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio against its background to pass for accessibility. The first example fails with a 2.41:1 ratio, and it also does poorly on general legibility due to tight line and letter spacing. While it's not inherently wrong to use colorful text, it can be more difficult to ensure the pairing meets contrast. The second example fails with a 2.59:1 ratio. The third example is poor legibility from using a thin font at a small size. And the fourth also fails for legibility by using a decorative font for a long text block at a small size. Let's look at some acceptable examples of text contrast. The first one demonstrates the exception to the text contrast rule. Text which is at least 14 pixels and bold, or larger than 18 pixels, has a reduced contrast ratio of 3:1. This example is both 18 pixels and bold, and has a ratio of 3.25:1. The next example passes contrast with flying and bright colors. The ratio here is 5.17:1. Next, there's an appropriate use of a thin font by increasing the size and limiting the length of the phrase. This might be acceptable for short headlines. Finally, we've reduced the decorative font all the way down to one word to demonstrate another exception. If we imagine this is intended as the logo, then it is acceptable because logos are specifically exempt from contrast guidelines, which makes the color choice okay too. The other category for contrast is interactive user interface components, such as form fields and buttons, as demonstrated here. UI components need to meet the 3:1 contrast for controls themselves, although text portions, such as form labels, should continue to meet 4.5:1 if not bold or smaller than 18 pixels. This first form field is missing the mark on contrast for both the label and the input border. The example next to it achieves appropriate contrast for both the label and input border. The buttons comparisons are set up much the same. However, buttons typically have the expectation of a hover state, which is when the user mouses over it. So if I hover over the Good button, you'll see that a dark background color has been applied, and the text color is swapped to white to retain contrast. Another important note is that now we must balance two levels of contrast. The button text against the button background at a 4.5:1, and the button background against the page background needs to meet at least 3:1. Now, the final key topic is keyboard interaction. There is a category of users, whether or not they use VO, who are unable to use a mouse, so they rely on either spoken or manual keyboard commands. A primary way these users navigate a website is tabbing from one interactive component to the next. For sighted users, it is important that interactive components provide visual feedback when they receive focus. Looking at our text inputs and buttons, I'm going to demonstrate focus from keyboard tabbing. As I tab into the Poor input field, the only indicator is the blinking text cursor. If I tab again into the Good input, there is a clear visual border change. This focus is also under the same 3:1 color contrast requirement, which should be measured against its surrounding background. I'll tab again to the Poor button and you'll see no change, and once more to the Good button, and you'll see we're using the same style offered on hover for this particular button. There are many more areas of accessibility to be aware of, and we will explore other areas as we continue through this series. If you would like to start learning more, a few resource links are in the video description. Stay tuned for the next video where we will learn what CSS is and get started using it. Be sure to subscribe. And if you're interested in early access to the final course videos and other future perks, support this project on Patreon. The link is in the video description.